So imagine that you were a kid or a uni student, perhaps, and your mum and dad decided one day that you would no longer be paid your pocket money on a fixed sum basis. Rather, under their new neoliberal parenting model, you would now be paid according to how much you spent. So the more you spent, the more pocket money you made. How good is this new pocket money model? And if your parents decided that you were not just on the piss, but also taking the piss, they could challenge you in the courts for overspending under your regulated return. But as you now had more money than they did, because your cost of doing business had rocketed, they could challenge you, but you could afford to pay a bunch of high-powered lawyers. And they could only afford the services of Dennis Tenuto and co. to argue their case. So they don't bother. It's what the energy market is like. It's called a regulated return. The more you spend, the more you make. Now, we're hearing a lot about energy bills in this election. We're hearing nothing, mind you, about who's making all the money from these outrageous prices. No follow the money, but it's all about, Albo, $275, he promised it's not happening, or Peter Dutton's new merch, Peter Dutton's magnificent nuclear energy scam. Not much about that. That's in witness protection now. But we're not hearing about who the biggest winners are financially from the mega grift of Australian consumers, which is the Australian energy market. A couple of billionaires in Hong Kong and London. They're the ones who make the most out of us. And we need some plain speaking about this, because daily now we're hearing from politicians and journalists about energy bill relief, about prices, about what they're going to do. Both parties tinker around the edges royally. Unfortunately, neither the politicians nor the media know what they're talking about. Nobody does. It's too difficult. It's not really their fault. It's touching the very veneer on the surface. It's 30 years of policy failure which has got us here. It's because, fundamentally, successive Australian governments and bureaucrats have designed a system so ludicrously complicated that nobody understands it except those who profit and profiteer from it. Let's start with the basics. The politicians have been subject to a range of scams over the year. They've been scammed by lobbyists, large electric companies, large gas companies, captive regulators are in there too. Here's one good metric. How many regulators are there in the electricity market? There are 3, actually, in Australia. Well, probably more, but 3 main ones that we know of. AEMC, the Australian Energy Markets Commission, the AER, the Australian Energy Regulator, and the AEMO, the Australian Energy Markets Operator. Why is this so? Because they designed such an effusively complex system that nobody could understand it. They had a model which worked back in the days, mind you. Call me old-fashioned, but it was called the SEC, the State Electricity Commission, whether you're in Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales. Power bills would go up 3% or whatever the rate of inflation was. And once every 6 months, the one guy in his little grey cardigan, the big bureaucrat in charge of the State Electricity Commission, would trudge up the hill to Senate estimates and answer questions of the politicians. If there were any blackouts, he'd be in trouble. If there was a blowout in costs and their costs, the bills were more than 3%, because that's what inflation was, he would be in trouble. He was the guy that was accountable, and he had a board of directors that was accountable also, that employed him. Alas, that system wasn't good enough. We fell for the neoliberal scam. The scam that everything is better in private hands, even essential services, essential monopoly services like keeping the lights on. And so it was that they corporatized it. Queensland, not so quickly, and New South Wales and Victoria. Victoria was first off under Jeff Kennett. They broke it up. For competition's sake, they said, make it more competitive, make them compete, these people, against each other. So they split them all up along the lines of what sort of electricity game they're in. They split up the generation capacity. That's the people who mine and drill the stuff, coal and the gas. They split up the distribution companies. That's the poles and wires. And they broke out the transmission companies. That's the big coat hangers, which crisscross the country and the valleys. And then, of course, the retail companies, That's the sales side of it, which flogs the stuff and pesters us on the phone every week the whole time. So suddenly we had not just 3 regulators, but dozens of companies. All these entities apparently competing with each other. Alas, they all had their own boards, their own management with bonuses, their own HR, their own PR, their finance people, their sales teams, the duplication of resources, the mouths to feed. But here's the kicker, the pièce de résistance, gold plating. How did they get paid? Their executive bonuses. How did they show what sort of profit they were making? Well, when we revealed all this about 10 or 15 years ago amid lawsuit threats and so on, when we're back at 9 Media, Sydney Morning Herald, we figured out that they were paid what they call a regulated return, back to the neoliberal parenting model. That is, the more money you spend, the more money you make. Suddenly, they're all getting about in new fleets of cars. Remember about 15 years ago? It's all these snazzy new cars. Think about the principle of it. The old how much. If you're paid by how much money you spend, it's a perverse principle. And so it was. Scam number 1 was corporatization. Scam number 2 was privatization, and then consolidation. Now we'll get to the latest scam, which is Peter Dutton's plan for a domestic gas reservation policy. The very words make the eyes glaze over. Every word boring. Domestic gas reservation policy. Nobody will understand what he's going on about. It's a scam. We'll get there later. It's a stalking horse, in fact, for drilling more gas onshore, for fracking. But privatisation. Now, having created in the 90s all these corporatised entities, they then privatised them, which was great for competition. Privatised an essential service set up to spend as much money as they could. So they did it. The best example of this, the best rort, is one we wrote about many times. Energy Australia, one of the 3 big gentailers. Now, a gentailer is a vertically integrated mob which arose because when they split the things up and corporatised them, the big guys started taking over the small guys and enjoyed the benefits of scale, vertical integration. Then we had the gentailers, AGL, Origin and Energy Australia, which ended up with control, in large part, of generation, distribution and retailing. But Energy Australia took it a step further. They awoke the giant within, without anybody noticing, apart from yours truly. They packaged up all this stuff that they bought in privatisations from state governments, and they re-domiciled it. They took it to the Caribbean, to the British Virgin Islands. Literally, we couldn't believe our eyes. We had to rub our eyes when we saw. We'd done the corporate searches going through all these entities, and we got there to the peak entity. Well, it wasn't even the peak. After that, it was Hong Kong and then London, etc. But the name of the entity was Energy Australia BVI. In other words, Energy Australia, British Virgin Islands. They still called it Energy Australia as if to be furtive. So they took this stuff, formerly owned by the public, to sunny Caribbean shores in order not to pay any tax, which they didn't. For many years, we caught them making billions, not paying any tax. I didn't like that much. Lots of no comments every year when we rang Energy Australia. So roughly a third of Australia's energy assets were now controlled by a mob in the Caribbean, which was in turn controlled by a mob in Hong Kong called CVI, which was in turn controlled. The one major shareholder, Chongqing Infrastructure, was a billionaire. Resident somewhere near Mayfair in London, a guy called Michael Kadoorie, who controlled this Hong Kong entity and therefore Energy Australia. There was another rich bloke from Hong Kong called Li Ka-shing, meanwhile, who'd skimmed off another big slab of the tastiest assets in the country and housed them in staple security so they didn't have to pay any tax. It was the unit holder's duty. We caught none of this this scam and the gold plating when we found that Transgrid, one of the big transmission mobs, the New South Wales one, which had been corporatised, we caught Transgrid working away on a $300 million transmission line up the north of the New South Wales coast, for which there was no need. And just building a whole lot of gigantic coat hangers in the middle of nowhere so they could show that they were spending money, therefore claim higher revenue and higher executive bonuses. There was no demand for it. It was just a big, humongous spend, because the more you spend, the more you make. Bonus time. That's what we call gold plating. But how about gas? The price on our bill is determined by this gold plating for sure, how much money they spend, but it's also about gas. The price of electricity is all about gas because at peak times, When the grid needs the gas companies to vend in gas for extra supply, they do so at very high prices. Gas peaking plants, peak demand. As they go, if you want our gas, you'll have to pay through the nose for it. The problem with the gas market, though, is it's not a market. They call it a market. It's a cartel controlled by a handful of producers, which brings us to our next scam. You see, markets. Well, a market is something which has a visible trading platform where you can see the buyers and you can see the sellers, you can see how much they want and at what price. Not so this market. Australia and our leaders were scammed 15 years ago. Gas used to be $3 a gigajoule, it went as high as 33, and a good deal of the problem was that LNG, the liquid form, was hyped as Australia's next export boom after coal and iron ore during the China supercycle. So instead of unitising this market, though, what they did is they let the big foreign players, BG, British Gas, and all the big American ones, all jump into the market and drop billions building their own LNG plants around Gladstone. Instead of unitising it and building one giant plant, like with Telstra, everybody uses Telstra's wires, you just hop on and use them and you pay a toll. They spent years, when they blew up all this money, recouping their cost of capital. The rub, and that ended up on our bills, the rub, however, was a thing called export price parity. Now, export price parity meant that from about 2009 onwards, when we started exporting the LNG, it meant that Australians had to pay the same price as the export price. So you struck a price with somebody in Japan or Europe or something, and even though the gas belonged to us, we still had to pay the same price as it was being exported for. And because there was no visibility, you couldn't see what the rorts were. Foreign-controlled market of tax dodgers. Look at all the gas players, Exxon and Chevron and Santos and Origin. They're all tax dodgers. And it got worse, of course, with the Ukraine war, put prices through the roof. And so we paid the same prices again during then, when it shot above $30 a gigajoule. A breathtaking policy fail. The government did not enact a domestic gas reservation policy, the very thing Peter Dutton's talking about now. But we need to see the detail, of course, because we think it's just an excuse to drill more onshore to frack. The government just listened to the gas lobby as usual and failed to earmark any of the massive gas production of Australian gas for Australians. They did it in Perth. In WA, they set it up from the beginning. Domestic gas reservation policy, a thing Dutton's just proposed. And that's why people in WA have always paid a lot less for their gas. They didn't do it here on the East Coast, because the federal government and the state governments on the East Coast are patsies for the gas corporations who don't donate them a lot of money and have their way with the politicians. This is no more evident than in the Rex Patrick scoop on the website last year, revealing how Santos basically writes the laws in their favour. And so our gas gets piped from all over the country to Gladstone, Queensland, wherever they drill it, turned into liquid, shipped 17,000 k's to Japan, turned back into gas and sold to Japan consumers, often at lower prices. And the Victorians, the poor old Victorians, pay down there right next to the Bass Strait where they drill the stuff. It's no market. Export price parity. And as an aside, it's worth mentioning that we also privatised gas transmission. That's the pipes, the pipelines which transmit the stuff around the country. So there are two players in this, basically, another duopoly. They're controlled by Jemena, is controlled by Singapore and China, 100%. Jemena, tax dodgers, and APA, Australian Pipelines Group, which is basically a very successful, it's a lucrative venture. It's a fancy staple trust structure which outperformed for years on the ASX, not paying any tax. That was up to unit holders. Made a mozza for many years. And they even put governments on the hook for white elephant projects, which were built with the help of the taxpayers, went on our bills as well, but never had any gas running through them. So there are a lot of lies going on in the gas sector. It's a massive scam on politicians and on all Australians. We renamed, when it came out last year, Australia's Future Gas Strategy Report, the Let's Burn More Stuff in Future strategy, because it's a climate wolf in sheep's clothing. This thing looks like the work of gas lobbyists and, of course, the media manipulation, the media being a duopoly too, the two major serious newspapers who have business sections, the AFR and the Oz. They just write what they're told. Rather than release reports so everyone could have a crack at it at the same time, they dropped it to their fossil media duopoly mates for kid gloves treatment so they could set the tone for public acquiescence, and they did. The truth is that nowhere is the government's complete and utter capitulation to its donors more visible than in the fossil fuel industry, and it's no better seen than in this future gas plan. There's some bizarro stuff in there. But to debunk it from the start, it presumes that we need to keep approving new gas projects and lock in gas supply for decades to come because supply versus demand ignores the fact that we export 80% of the stuff at high prices, export price parity. We need to drill more of the stuff, they claim, because we don't have enough gas for the energy transition. It's absolute nonsense. We're swimming in the stuff. The vast majority of it is exported by multinational companies that don't pay any tax. Here's a ripper though. The report mentions that the International Energy Agency, the IEA, it mentions IEA 88 times, but fails to mention once that the IEA's firm position is, quote, no new fossil fuel projects. This used to be funded by coal. They're much more avant-garde than our policymakers over there in Geneva or wherever the IEA is based. This is classic PR. The authors want us to think that they've relied on serious authoritative sources for their work rather than just their mates in the gas lobby. How many times is the PRRT mentioned? That's the miserable failure of a gas tax. Precisely once. It was meant to raise billions. It's a complete joke. The only mention was buried deep in the bibliography at the end of a 100-page report. This is majestic symbolism, delivering value to Australia rather than Santos, Shell, Exxon, Chevron and BHP is a footnote. Australians who vote get no vote on this. The decision of politicians is bought. The second lie in this report, in this whole way that we approach energy markets, is we need more gas to keep the gas price low. Gas price has not been low for years, ever since a decade ago when they set up their LNG export policy and export price parity kicked in. We paid excessive prices. Every man, woman and child has been robbed by this cartel because gas goes into electricity. Every small business in the country has been penalised, and they want to keep that going. The third lie is that we need gas to transition to net zero. It's true that we cannot transition to net zero because the industry is not geared up for it as yet, although the answer is quite clear from experts. We just need for wind and solar power and batteries to proliferate small scale and large scale across the country. It would be not that difficult to do. The transition will be a fair cost when transmission infrastructure is put in place, but otherwise it can be done. And the experts, AEMO for instance, say that it can be done. We don't need coal, we don't need new gas. We just have to safely stop approving new projects and do what we've got and use what we've got already. The other one is that it ignores this Scope 3 emissions thing, which are emissions which cook the planet, and only mentions Scope 1 emissions, ones that are born here. Lie number 4, supply and demand. If supply and demand were real because we got so much gas, if it was fair dinkum, and the profits weren't all just being exported to foreign multinationals, then the gas price would be lower because we create so much supply in this country. And then, of course, there's a massive lie, which is CCS, carbon capture and storage. We pay for that. We subsidise these highly profitable companies to do carbon capture and storage, which doesn't work commercially virtually anywhere in the world. It's just another con. It was debunked almost 20 years ago, maybe 15. So it's a mess. But around this mess, which is energy, around this mega grift, is a powerful gravy train which rips out billions in profits, most of it offshore. The deal's all executed by lawyers and engineering consultants and the corporate foot soldiers of a massive privatised industry. And the regulators, well, they're mostly captured, as many of our past investigations have shown. Dozens of stories on this we've done. AEMO's probably the best of them. Better funded than the AER. But if you look at it, it's a gold-plating beauty, this AEMO. Because what they do is they make unrealistic forecasts. They've done it for years. They've overblown forecasts for years, and they're half-owned by industry. It's not government. So why is consumption, if you check out this chart, if AEMO's forecasts were reliable and not designed to inflate demand for gold plating. They're saying, even though the gas price has been falling, they're forecasting it to triple over the coming years. And the media, they just played a solid role in all this, ignoring the economic reality, the financial reality of gas and electricity corporations running rings around politicians and them, of course. Gas shortages. Oh no, routinely every couple of weeks. Oh, there's going to be a gas shock, a gas crisis. We won't be able to keep warm this winter. They've been saying that for 2 decades. It's an excuse to drill more gas to export profits. They've been relentless in delivering the social license for all Australians to be ripped off the media because they've run these ridiculous stories. What could have been? What could have been? Well, that's an easy answer. Just look at Norway. Look at Norway, where the state has control over the oil and gas wealth, and they have taxed it properly. I mean, it's chalk and cheese. There's more tax on beer in Australia than there is gas drilled by foreign corporations. As for royalties, more than half of the exports of gas incur no royalties, so they're effectively fracking up farmland and getting this stuff for nix, because the royalty payment is one that goes to the state for the benefit, in payment, a cost of goods sold, for drilling this stuff which belongs to all Australians and taking it out of the ground and exporting it. That's what a royalty is. It's not income tax. More than 50% of it, 56% of it, attracts no royalties for the cartel. Zero payments to the people who own the stuff, us. The scale of this stuff up is so immense that it really needs a Royal Commission, but that would take a couple of years. And it's just too complicated. The government is basically in hock to the gas cartel and bleating the same lines of the gas lobby. It used to be called APIA, now it's called Australian Energy Producers. They can't even get their financial statements right, and they hide them and duck for cover, refuse to comment, except if you're a journalist from the Australian or the Fin Review, they'll be all over you like a rash, probably taking you out for 3-course lunches. Their media agents and the media duopoly could not have done a better job. And it's cost every business and household in Australia. So where do we stand? Completely stuffed. That's where we stand. A Royal Commission would be good. It would probably save money because some of the scams will be exposed. We haven't even touched on the rorts amid the rorts. I mean, there's a thing called the dorc rort, DORC, where energy companies are valuing old assets such as gas pipelines, things that consumers have already paid for, as if they were brand spanking new. We, the mug punters, are lumbered with the cost on our power bills as a result of the dorc rort. Dorc stands for Depreciated Optimised Replacement Cost. Its moniker alone is sufficient to discourage further inquiry. But this is like if you privatise the Sydney Harbour Bridge and sold it to new owners who could enjoy the benefit of the tolls. This is like the dorc rort spanking a big new valuation on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, after getting advice from lawyers and consultants, of course, that it was now worth twice as much, so you could bill consumers, bill drivers, more money for their tolls. The effect is that we pay for the Sydney Harbour Bridge twice, and that's what we do with energy assets, because they've got this ridiculous thing called dorc, which just games the whole system. Just another rort. Take lawyers a year to get their heads around that one for a start, because the guys in on the game will be earning too much from the dorc rort, so they wouldn't be blowing the whistle on that little tidy scam. It's all about accounting chicanery for the privateers. In the wash-up then, it's so big, it's impossible to derail this energy market gravy train, packed as it is with teeming passenger list of lawyers and other hanger-oners, all the people in the industry. The only solution is to beef up the regulators to tackle the more glaring abuses. So there you have it. Gold plating. It's a story that we thought we'd just tell as a story. You know, having covered this thing for 2 decades and seen all the rorts and covered all the rorts, we just think it's worthwhile telling our side of the story. It might not be 100% correct even, but it's correct to the best of our knowledge. We're all victims of a major league grift. Thank you. Please like, share and comment in the section below, and hit the bell and subscribe if you can.